firstly start off by framing climate change. I don't know what you all know about this, so if I'm going too slow into things you all know, then just please just tell me to bypass that stuff and get on to the more nitty-gritty parts towards the end. So I'm going to try and frame climate change and bring it from a global down to a UK and then arguably to a Manchester level, and then I'm going to try and bring up some pointers as to some of the issues that I think might be important for this particular committee, for Manchester, and indeed I think at the UK level. So I'll try and pass through that in about 15 to 20 minutes, so a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I will go through some stuff on climate change to start off with, for those of you that weren't at the previous council event. Well, I just should say, I've called it From Rhetoric to Reality, Facing the Challenges of Climate Change, which is one of the many titles I use, but it's trying to get away from the rhetoric, from the high-level language that we've been using a long time in the UK around climate change, to say what does this actually mean on the ground. And I don't mean the rhetoric here to be pejorative. You know, rhetoric is something we have to go through. And to the UK's credit, it's probably ahead of many parts of the world in that the rhetoric is well advanced now. But I think it's fair to say that the reality is somewhat lagging. But it's part of the process they've gone through that. So I'm going to the global context to start off with. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, this is their perspective, but you can get the same thing from PricewaterhouseCoopers or the World Bank, or many institutions will say something similar now. And this is becoming the orthodox view that when you look at the CO2 data, we're heading towards very high temperatures. They're saying 6 degrees C over the century. Now, on a cold day in Manchester doesn't sound too bad, but globally that is utterly devastating, as they point out. So this is from the IEA, who are normally an organ of the established energy sort of structures around the globe, which you could say is mostly fossil fuel oriented. So it's quite interesting that they're coming out and repeatedly saying these sorts of statements. And indeed, this is the new chair of the World Bank saying that, according to them, even at 4 degrees C rise, you'll start to see food and water fights around the globe. So where we're heading at the moment is a place that almost across the board, there's very little disagreement that this is a world we can't go towards, so we have to do something to get off that. So what of the UK? Well, the UK has signed up internationally, indeed reaffirmed it last year at the Camp David Declaration with the G8 nations, to make its fair contribution to hold the global temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius. Now, the below there is actually quite important, and actually pivotal in this set of issues, and then coming back to the economy and then back to what that means for Manchester. So below 2 degrees Celsius, and take action to meet this based on science and based on equity. And again, the equity part is important at a global level, and I would argue it's very important when you come down to cities like Manchester, many cities around the UK where you see big equity issues. The UK has a low carbon transition plan, which is been evolving over time, but that again sort of couches climate change in must not exceed 2 degrees C. So we want rises in temperature, we want to keep the rise in temperature around the globe less than 2 degrees C, and I'll say that is important. That language is absolutely pivotal here. So what of Manchester? Well, Manchester has its own climate change strategy, and some of you can tell me if I've got some of this wrong, but I think this is all broadly correct. That GM intends to make its contribution, so along with the UK make its fair contribution, Manchester make its fair contribution to targets set out in the low carbon transition plan, remember, below 2 degrees C. And that's the right thing to do. And obviously I think most of us here, if not all of us, would agree that that's correct, that we need to do that within Manchester to show a lead. And indeed many other countries need to do it as well. That radical action on carbon emissions is needed in order to pass a viable and safe future onto climate onto future generations. Again, I think something we would all agree with, that we need to be doing something along those lines, that the future generations are as important, arguably in some respects more important than the current generations, in that we've caused a problem and we mustn't really pass it on to our children. The 2020 target for CO2 emissions reduction of 48%. And then if you look at the Manchester Certain Future, the refreshed document, the headline objective is a 41% reduction in emissions of carbon dioxide by 2020. And there are slightly different baselines, but that's not too important an issue, and certainly not for this talk now. So Manchester, the question is really clear. From a mitigation perspective, from an emission reduction perspective, we have to say, what does Manchester need to do to make its fair contribution as part of a global effort to stay below 2 degrees Celsius? Now, how are these playing out? We've got 4 degrees C from the World Bank that we're heading towards, or 6 if you look at the IEA, and we've got us all signing up to 2 degrees C. Now, how is that actually historically playing out? And that's quite important to think what we need to do going forward, because these are the lessons we've had since 1980 here. The United Nations got together in 1988 to set up the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That was set up in 1988, chaired by John Houghton, a UK scientist, and very much pushed forward by the government of the day, actually. We had the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, Just look here, what we've got along the bottom are years from 1980 to 2050, and CO2 up the side, billions of tonnes of CO2. We had the Royal Commission report, very important in 2000, let's talk about 60% reduction in emissions by 2050. David King's comment on climate change more important than international terrorism, the Copenhagen Accord, and then the Rio Plus 20 event last year. Now, Rio Plus 20 was supposed to be Rio Plus 20 years, but really it's Rio Plus 20 gigatons. We've actually doubled, we've increased our emissions over the time we've been concerned by 20 billion tonnes of CO2 per annum. And that keeps going up. So that's what we've achieved over the time we've claimed to be really interested in climate change. We now have an economic downturn, which is, I think, still continuing within the West. Certainly it's a more of a Western phenomenon than it's a global phenomenon. But at the same time, emissions have still risen at rates well above those that we saw during the Industrial Revolution, or certainly at the same rate, if not well above that level. And remember, that's from a higher number every year. So the Industrial Revolution had very little level of emissions. We've got very high emissions, and the rate of increase is really significantly going up. And if we think about the future, this is important for Manchester as it is to any part of the world here. When we build something, it lasts for a long time. If you build new power stations, if we go along George Osborne's view of new gas-fired power stations, they will be running for 25 to 30 years. If we build a nuclear station, it'll probably be running for 50 years. If we build a wind turbine, it's probably something like a gas station. If we build buildings like this, I don't know what age this one is, but I mean, you're sort of talking buildings that are well over 100 years old, that most of the infrastructure that we've put in place will be here for 100 plus years. So when we put things in place, we must think we're locking in our children's future to using that infrastructure. If you build aircraft or ships, they have a 30-year life. So we start to think about this. What we do today has a decadal time frame impact for our children and for other generations, and indeed for ourselves. So we mustn't lose the fact that it's not about the future, it is about the present impacting the future. Let's assume that the world does what it says it's going to do on climate change, then don't worry too much about the numbers unless you're interested in the, if you are, I can put you towards papers and you can obviously have these slides. What we're seeing is a rapid increase in emissions over the century. This is only up to 2050, which is really no time away from where we are today, 2050. And at the moment we're heading towards a 4 to 6 degrees C temperature rise over this century. This assumes there are no feedbacks in the system, which could make it much worse than this, but this is taking a slightly more optimistic view of it. So we're actually heading to a world which we all would accept, I think, by and large, is one we must avoid. And yet we're signing up to commitments to the 2 degrees centigrade that looks like that. And there's obviously a huge gap between those two. The top one is rhetoric, I would argue, and the bottom one is the reality of what we need to try and do. So there's a huge gap between those two pathways, and those pathways are what inform policy, which then feeds back ultimately into Manchester City Council and this committee. What's the orthodox view about overcoming that gap? Take this from the top curve to the bottom curve. This is from the Committee on Climate Change in their 2009 and the 2011 report. To keep global average temperatures rises close to 2 degrees C, the UK must cut emissions by at least 80%. And they had to say this next part. I know this because I've talked to them quietly off the record, as is the case with all scientists. They say something different off the record, or many scientists in this area. The good news is that reductions of that size are possible without sacrificing the benefits of economic growth and rising prosperity. They had to put that in, otherwise it wouldn't have got published. 2 degrees C, an alternative take. And I've spoken to the people at the Committee on Climate Change, indeed their chief scientist, who broadly disagree with any of the analysis I'm putting forward here. So I've spoken to him on a number of occasions about this, and his strategy team actually. And our paper we had in 2011 said it is difficult to envisage anything other than a planned economic recession. This is particularly for the wealthy parts of the world, being compatible with stabilisation at or below roughly 4 degrees C. So we're saying the maths situation now, particularly in 2013, mean that you cannot actually hold to 2, even to 4 degrees C rise, without actually thinking about your levels of consumption. And I'll come back to that as I pass through the talk, because I don't think that initially sounds very, very negative, but I think there are different ways of interpreting what that might mean. And just to explain why that's the case, the initial part coming off the curve, as you can see here, it's too early for supply. You can't build nuclear power stations before 2020, and you won't get more than about 3 or 4 by 2030. You can't build enough wind turbines by 2020, 2025. You can't build enough gas-fired power stations with carbon capture and storage. You cannot put in place the infrastructures on low-carbon energy fast enough to get us off the curve. So in the short term, you have no option but to reduce demand. And this is at a global level. It's much tighter than this if you think of the poorer parts, the richer parts of the world, and issues of equity, that we should be taking a slightly larger hit than the poorer parts. So in the short term, there's no way off that curve other than reducing demand. But at the same time, the supply part is absolutely pivotal. There's a prerequisite here to get low-carbon energy supply in place. But let's be blunt about it, it won't penetrate the system significantly in the West until probably 2030. And at the current rate